Hi, Jimmy. Thank you for accepting to take this interview today. It is a pleasure. I look forward
Very-
to chatting with you.
Of course. Very nice to
Um,
meet with you, Enes.
for the sake of our viewers, I thought I'd quickly give a little intro of myself, and then you can take it away and talk about all the great things you've done. I'm here on behalf of like the Oxford Business Network for Sustainability. And I'm an MBA and I used to work in corporate sustainability, and I plan to keep sustainability at the center of um, my journey post MBA. I am also an alumni of Oxford through the geography school, so we have that in common. Um, Amongst some the other MBA commonality. Yeah, I'm delighted that we get to talk today.
Likewise, likewise.
If you could tell us about maybe your journey, a little bit about what you did and where you are now, and how you got to this PhD at Oxford University, and maybe a couple of like lessons learned along the way, and how you got all the way here.
Yeah, why don't I just start by going backwards? I'll start with where I am today and kind of go back in time to where I started with. At the moment, I am a mid-career PhD. I just finished my degree in carbon accounting based out of the Smith School in the School of Geography, but I collaborate quite strongly with the business school here. And where the observation was that I worked on in the carbon accounting was really this noticing that mass balances with carbon flows is very much similar to energy balances inside energy flows, which happens to be very similar to financial balances and cash balances that we find inside accounting systems. And so, gosh, isn't that kind of funny that these three systems all function on balances? And the more we looked into that, the more we realized that the analogies went even further from there. It wasn't just the fact that all three systems were in balances, but all three systems manages stocks and flows. It's just that in finance, we call them assets and expenses, whereas in energy and carbon, we call it embodied and operational. And so when we started looking at these systems, we realized, wait a minute, we can actually apply financial accounting into energy and carbon accounting. And that actually makes these all three systems a little bit more robust. So that being the PhD, the 10 years before my PhD, I was actually an energy entrepreneur and I ran my own company doing energy management and commercial real estate. And it was during that time which we made the observation that the energy system was in balance, which is well known. You can't create or destroy energy, right? But when you're doing commercial energy management, you're really doing it from a consumption point of view. The balance comes from the fact that it's generated somewhere else by the electric utility. There's a generator that balances out your consumption. And then the transmission and distribution system is just simply how that energy gets transported to you. It's kind of like shipping and handling of energy. You can think of it that way. And so, even though I was doing energy management in commercial real estate, because the energy system was in balance, I also did a lot of work with utilities and smart grids, looking at the transmission, distribution, and generation assets, because this entire system has to function in balance. And so that was basically done for about 10 years of my life, where not only was it a technical optimization, it was also a strategic optimization because we were, in order to try to do something of that broad scale, you were working with the strategists, the C suites, the board members of all these different companies along the entire supply chain. And before starting my company, I actually did my MBA here at SBS, so an alum jointly with Ines here. And prior to coming to the Oxford MBA, I was a capital equipment salesperson, and I sold microscopes into industrial manufacturing facilities in the US Northeast. And so that was Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Maine. And that experience was really instrumental in learning because anyone who's doing anything in business, at the end of the day, needs to be able to sell. And the sales is effectively the the grounding of any successful company. Without sales, without revenue, there is no company. And so the art of sale and the discipline of sales is something that is foundational to business. So why was I doing sales? Well, the reason was because prior to doing sales, I was a laser engineer. And when I was a laser engineer and I was working at Panasonic and I was working on really technical issues, fiber Bragg ratings, amorphization of silicon semiconductors and things, it was really intellectually stimulating. It was really fascinating. My original career, my original education was in material science. And so that's why I look at issues from an energy and materials background. But that experience in the technology, as much as I really enjoyed it and liked it, I felt like there was always something missing in the larger, broader scheme of things. Because at the end of the day, R&D is just one component of what a company is. And so in order to try to understand what a company is, my mentors back in the time told me that I really had to go into sales if I was really serious about it. And I guess I was, because that's what I did. And so here I am now.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I think your career is truly fascinating because you've worn so many of these different hats. And it's interesting how the domain and the field of geography allows you to wear these different hats. So, so my next question is, how do you think the field of geography as a place that um, cherishes itself or like puts itself forward as a place that connects the dots, how do you think going forward in a academic like space in geography has allowed you to find these connections? And people talk about systems thinking and these kinds of multifaceted approaches, but I'm interested to think what your reflections are about this.
That's a really good question. And let me just say a couple of observations. I have, through my career, I have been very fortunate to basically come through three different schools. I come from the School of Engineering when I did my original degrees in material science, the School of Business through SBS here at Said Business School, but then also School of Geography, which is much more deeply research into social science. And each one of those disciplines have a completely different way of looking at the world. And when I was an engineer, I wouldn't completely discounted the other two views of the world. But then after learning business, I go, oh, wait a minute, there's actually value and there's a reason and a contribution to society from the business point of view. And now that I've been in geography, I also see how they are different and how they contribute to the world as well. And so it just like, you said you're from Switzerland and you speak many languages, and it's something that you're very proud of, that the fact that you can translate through many languages. Translating between disciplines is also a skill. And the way that I talk to an engineer and the vocabulary and even the cadence of how I would speak about certain topics is quite different than the cadence of how I would speak about the exact same topic to a CFO, which is very different than how I would explain it to an economist or a standard setter or someone who sits inside the geography department. And so I think one thing is the more exposure you can get as a young person to different points of views and to really learn their disciplinary language, the more valuable that's going to get.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, I think. And so in terms of how you can use these different languages and incite changes and bring people like on your side or come halfway, how have you managed that relationship, and how have you dealt with this difficult, very difficult journey that we have bringing people to come forward and put solutions on the line for climate change in the environment? And how have you managed those frustrations with like slow paces of change?
That's something we deal with all the time. And when I used to do energy man, or in really any of my roles, I sit on a couple of boards, and on the boards you'll have lawyers, you'll have accountants, you'll have government representatives, you'll have financial people, and everyone comes with a slightly different points of view. And um, that Excuse me.
Bless you.
And each one of those different points of view are valid, but sometimes they're opposed to each other. Um, for example, like we're struggling with this right now, this entire problem with AI of, yeah, we want
Mhm.
to have equitable jobs for our staff, and that is something that is in our mission statement. And so there are things that we have done which has been above average, going above and beyond what is needed for, say, retraining and maintaining existing staff. But yet at the same time, we're faced with the reality that AI is going to be a giant cost-cutting measure. And so, how do you balance these two tensions essentially? Of one side, it's being very people oriented, and the other side being very cost conscious. And so, there's lots of different ways to deal with it, but you have to be able to have that conversation first and to understand where those problems are and where those boundaries are before you can start looking at the intersections. And so, for us, the an avenue of approach, and I'm not saying this is the only avenue, but one avenue of approach is using AI to also retrain the existing staff such that they can be more productive at their current job and or retrain them into new jobs that don't exist today. And just as much as we can use AI to do cost cutting, we can also use AI to retrain. And so it's taking the same tools that we have to understand how can we then shift it over or parry it over into something completely different. When I was in the built environment, if you ask someone inside the built environment, go to the mechanical contractor, go to facilities, go to the architect, and said who's responsible for sustainability, everyone is going to tell them how they are trying to be the most sustainable that they possibly can for the building that they put together. But however, they can't do X, Y, and Z because this other person in this other table doing that job is preventing them. And after talking about 11 or 14 different people, realizing everyone was pointing fingers at someone else in that group of people or group of disciplines, I realized that no one had responsibility. Everyone had good intentions, and everyone blamed someone else for why they couldn't do more. And so rather than using that and saying, oh, woe is me, nothing's going to happen, I instead flipped it on his shoulder and said, well, if that's the case, how do I assume that responsibility and be the leadership nexus to drive change inside of buildings rather than be the ones that can't drive change inside of the building? And so, and a big part of, I think, my personal philosophy is that we tend to pass the buck a lot when it comes to climate, of that it's someone else's responsibility or there's something else that's blocking me from being able to do it. And I take the exact opposite approach. I just go, you know what? I'll just take responsibility. I don't care then. Fine. I'll take the responsibility. Come at me. If you can't get something solved, great. Come to me. We'll figure it out together.
Yeah, yeah, accountability and sometimes just initiative, I think takes a
Yeah.
long way. Um, and talking about initiative and solutions, um, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how like solutions can come from the business sector, but also academia. And you've put a foot very much in both, and you've experienced very interesting things in both these places. So my question is, how should we encourage the conversation between the two in proposing climate solutions? And where have you seen that work well in your experience?
Yeah. The two fields, academia and practice, are good at two completely different things. And again, the translation between them is also really interesting. I would also try to differentiate academia from taught classes like MBAs or undergraduates or taught
Mhm.
master's programs to research programs. And even within academia, those two are quite different. Within the taught classes, people are generally learning a skill. You're learning how to be a barrister. You're learning how to be an electrician. You're learning how to be a manager. And there are norms and ways that we pass down those traditions and we pass down those skills. But then on the research side, you're trying to do something that no one has ever done before. And so you're trying to push the boundaries of human knowledge. And when
Mhm.
you're pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and you're doing something that no one has ever done before, you really don't know what's going to happen, right? You don't know if it's going to succeed. You don't know if it's going to get adopted. If you knew, it wouldn't be called research anymore. And so the researchy side is super fascinating because you get to do all of these weird, crazy, off the wall, try ideas sort of a thing and to see what happens. But just like any idea that is new, it's it's also high risk of whether it works or not works when it comes to hit reality. And I'm defining reality as hits practice. What the practice people are looking for is they're really good at optimizing. They can take an idea and they can really turn it into a well-oiled machine that runs smoothly, that makes money, that pays people, that delivers products, that does things repeatable, fast,
Mhm.
high quality, low defects. And so they're really good at that. But they're generally less good at the having time to think and having space to ponder and having space to be able to say where should things go. And whereas in research you get 3 years 5 years of protection essentially, where you're just really thinking and you're reading and you're discussing and you're sharing and things. And the more these two groups can work together to share, the better. The practice side has a lot of data, a lot of experience, a lot of what works and what doesn't work. And the academic side has a lot of time on their hands to ponder, to think, to find connections. They're not tied to being having to deliver quarterly profits, on a regular basis, but they can take a little bit more time to imagine and to think. And so the way that I see these two worlds going, and I love the fact that I straddle between these two worlds as well, is that inside academia, I get to think and I get to understand and I get to ponder and I get to create and invent in some sort of a way. And then once it's that is done and the space is created for that in academia, I can go into practice and implement. I can go and try to make it into a well-oiled machine and built and turned and run, and then it can potentially scale.
Yeah, no, and I think your background in engineering coming through now in terms of like turning an idea into a functional machine, basically. Um, that's extremely interesting. And how would you like think about this in terms of, so I know that you've worked well, you were talking earlier about like how the energy flows and the finance flows were quite similar. And when you're talking about like this well-oiled machine, I was thinking about basically what you were trying to achieve in improving this well-oiled energy flow. So I would be very interested to hear like how that thought runs through that like project you had in this. I mean, it was a full company actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So the way I think about it is if you were a strategy consultant, in one of the big four, and you were hired by a company to make that company more efficient, what would inevitably happen is that you would get all of the financial information of the company, you'd run it through all different sorts of models, you'd run deep analysis over the financial flows, and you would generate business process optimizations of how that company could be more efficient. What we did was we scrutinized the energy flows of a company, of what came in, what went out. The embodied energy of a material is energy. We consider that a legitimate source of energy, not just the electricity bill and the natural gas bill. But when you look at everything a company does, everything is rooted somewhere in energy. And so we looked at the flow of energy. And when you looked at the flow of energy, it's basically a different matrix, right? You have financial flows that you can come up with process optimizations. And then we looked at energy flows and they came up with a completely different set of business process optimizations. And they were things that were invisible to just financial analysis. And then so when you would be able to find those business process optimizations, typically speaking, what you ended up with was a more profitable company. You ended up with a more resilient company. But the the better resiliency and the higher profit came because at the same time you reduce the cash needs, reduce the expenses, and you reduce the energy costs at the same time. Well, if you're reducing energy and reducing money, you're improving profitability and you're improving the carbon footprint of the company at the same time, right? So all of those benefits came together. But to give you an example of how uh, looking at energy could give you different business process optimizations. You look at a utility bill, great, it gives you a number. Okay. Some of that is lights, probably 10-15% is all of the lights inside of your building. Great. You start looking at that and you go, well, but the light bulb, well, the electricity is just one part of the expense. There's also a light bulb. Okay. How many different light bulbs are there inside of a building? Do you have just one light bulb or do you have 50 light bulbs if you're a skyscraper? Or do you have 100 different light bulbs if you're a skyscraper? 100 different light bulbs means you have 100 different ballasts, which are the things behind the light bulb. That means you have 100 different connections going into the building, into the main controller systems. Okay, great. So for each one of those different light bulbs and different ballasts, how many spares do you need to keep? And if one of them breaks, what's your work order process to be able to replace it? And if they make a mistake, what's the delay of the work order from the facilities team? And so therefore, how many weeks do you have to sit in the dark before something actually gets fixed, right? And so all of a sudden, your cost basis of energy related to lights is something completely different. And if you think of a business process optimization, the first step might be don't use 50 different light bulbs. Why don't you streamline it to 5? And if you streamline it to 5, what does that mean? That means potentially the work orders might have fewer mistakes in them, fewer human mistakes in both, something breaks as well as something to repair, fewer amount of space needed to store all this stuff. And if you calculate the savings of storage, what that means is you might have more rental space because you don't need as much of a storage capacity anymore. Oh, smaller storage, more rental space, that's higher revenue. That's not just saving costs anymore. And so, really, really quickly, what you can find is that an action of something like standardizing on light bulbs is a massive business process optimization. But how many times could you find that just by scrutinizing financial flows, right? But that insight comes from the scrutiny of the energy flows.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Looking at the whole system and the consequences there. Um, no, thank you. That explanation was really interesting. I have a question slightly more about your career, just having in mind our audience. And you've done lots of different things, and I think it seems like you were always had like climate or the environment on your mind. So my question is, how did you keep that focus considering maybe when you started engineering, the environment, the climate wasn't necessarily the most employable job? And what kept you motivated and what kept you curious to keep pushing for this problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the way I like to answer that is to say that climate itself is kind of a broad umbrella of which there are many disciplines that are attached to that umbrella. And that means we need engineers, we need scientists, we need business people, we need accountants, we need lawyers, we need communicators, we need activists, we need all of those people to function underneath this umbrella with each one of those different disciplines. And even though my career has meandered, going from the engineering discipline to business to governance to research and things, I have always made sure to stay underneath that umbrella rather than moving across different umbrellas. Like going into healthcare or going into communications or going into uh, uh, international development. Just as an example, right? But I always made sure to keep myself underneath the climate umbrella, even though I was changing specific disciplines within it. And that did a couple of things. It meant that each one of the skills that I learned, I could bank, right? I am legitimately a materials engineer, even though I don't use it on a daily basis. But that skill set is banked in terms of my knowledge base, just like the skill set of being an entrepreneur is banked because I did that for 10 years. Um, and each one though builds on top of each other because they added to my expertise of climate knowledge, I would say. And so I think to someone who's starting off in a career, pick a sector, pick something that's large enough that you can do lots of different disciplines and have lots of different skills underneath. It's really hard to know that, hey, I very few people will go and say, I'm going to be a lawyer because I want to be a barrister and I'm going to be the happiest for the next 40 years being a barrister. So I'm just going to do that. People tend to change their careers every 10 years. And every career change requires a different sets of skills. But as long as that umbrella is the same, the knowledge is additive and accumulates.
Yeah. And my final question, a little bit along those lines, is about choosing to do a PhD now. We were chatting about this just before. You're possibly not the average PhD age. You have a lot of experience behind you. You come in very well informed. Um, First of all, would you say that's a better way of doing a PhD, or how would you recommend that experience? And did you expect to do a PhD when you were finishing your master's or doing your undergrad? And what are the benefits of kind of doing things slightly different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my observation of PhDs, I've hung around academia my entire life, in and out, right, over and over again. And what I have observed is that if you take the cohort of PhD students broadly, there are those who went straight through without having worked, and there are those who have worked for a few years and then come back. Um, and what I've often found is that the people who have worked for a couple of years and come back tended to be the happiest. And what I mean by that is they tended to have, bought various different widgets that they, liked. They have traveled, they have seen the world, they have worked experience and understood practically how things generally functioned. And when I was teaching inside, in a previous career teaching inside of organizations, the practitioner PhDs were asked the best questions because they knew what was important. They could prioritize. Whereas, and so the benefit of being someone coming back into academia from working is I think people get a better sense of what is important and what's not important. The risk of that is that, generally speaking, once you go into practice, it's much, much harder to want to come back into academia for a variety of reasons, right? And I think that is the downside of saying, hey, maybe I'll push off a advanced degree off into the future. You might not want to come back into that type of an environment. And I think that is a worthwhile trade-off that everyone has to make is do I go for that degree today, or do I get some more experience and come back later? What I will say is if you do go off work and then come back for a degree, you know why you're there because you made an active choice to come back into academia rather than kind of just do the next thing because it was the application cycle and it was just the best thing to do. But the motivation, the reason for coming back is much clearer. And for me, it was because I had this observation of cash flow, energy flow, and carbon flow all look the same. And gosh, wouldn't that be an interesting problem to work on for a few years? And so I did. But for me, coming into the DPhil PhD with that specific problem that I knew in my head was kind of a 3 to 5 year problem, and that was all I was going to do with it. And I didn't stray. Sure enough, I didn't stray from that problem. That's what I came in with. And now, 5 years later, that's what I've been able to, again, bank in my experience and now build into the next part of my career.
Yeah, that's really fun. It's really interesting as well. I'm realizing we're coming to the end of this interview. If you have a final piece of advice or just something you'd like to share with your audience, you're welcome.
I think the thing I'd love to share is I think Nike says it right, which is just do it. I see a lot of people hesitate on making climate decisions and climate choices because it's complicated. But you know what? Just do it. You'll learn, you'll understand, and you'll grow. So just do it.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Jimmy, for sharing all your insights. And it's been wonderful to chat with you today. And thank you to our audience for watching us.
Great. Thank you, Inez, as well. Take care.
Goodbye.